And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm the director of TeachThought PD. And I'm excited to share a few announcements that relate to our TeachThought professional development work. First off, we are now officially offering school partnerships. We've always engaged schools in longer-term work and have always promoted that because we believe it's more effective and impactful, but we've now made it official, and you can find out more on that by navigating to wegrowteachers.com, and you'll find a menu item along the top that says School Partnerships, and if you click there, it'll give you some more information. We are also excited to open pre-registration for next summer's TeachThought Grow 20, our fourth annual PBL professional learning event in downtown Louisville. The dates will be June 22nd through 24th, and official registration won't open for maybe a couple months, probably early January, but you can pre-register now, which basically puts your name on a list, and you'll be first to be notified when early bird registration opens, like I said, probably in January. Hopefully those are of interest to you, and if so, please navigate on over. Feel free to email me with any questions, drew@teachthought.com, and of course we always encourage you and appreciate visiting teachthought.com and sharing any and all of our content with your friends and professional networks, including this podcast. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Houston Kraft, who is the co-founder of Character Strong, and he's a motivational speaker and works with schools around the country and around the world on things of social emotional learning and character development, which is, of course, what we spoke about. Some of the things we discussed were whether schools actually should be in charge or be working with students in teaching character, the idea of navigating the world of kindness and honesty, which are some of the character development traits in light of the sort of woke culture, social justice mindset that we're seeing in some ways, and how that squares with honesty and humility or intellectual humility. The idea of building responsible decision-making abilities, and then some of the things that get in the way of doing this kinds of work. And one of those things, of course, is inconsistency and rooting the work in purpose and the why. And then kind of touched on the value of assemblies and how those actually fit with the larger work that they do and the goal of the assemblies that they're trying to achieve. So interesting conversation insofar as I think that, as I mentioned, really building students' ability to navigate interpersonally and intrapersonally contributes to effective teaching and learning. So I hope you find the conversation useful. Houston, welcome to the podcast. I'm with Houston Kraft, who is a motivational speaker, co-founder of Character Strong, and does lots of work in climate and culture and character and kindness and social emotional. So I'm not sure exactly where this conversation is going to go, but there's certainly lots of ways it could go, and I think all pertinent to educators and helping students and learners be better prepared for the modern world. So Houston, if you would give us a little bit more background on who you are and how you got to the current station in life.
How did we arrive here? Well, grateful for having me today, Drew. I think today is going to be a fun, as we were just sharing right before we pressed record, the organic conversations, the exchange of ideas is always where I think magic happens when it comes to this work. My name's Houston. I've been in the work of education for about the past 11 years. Worked for some time with a mentorship program, transitions programming, helping underclassmen be effective role models for incoming freshmen. or incoming sixth graders. Shortly out of college, I started doing speaking in schools, which I loved and have still love for many years, storytelling and trying to convince people to be thoughtful and kind to one another. And back in 2016, I came together with one of my heroes and friends and mentors, a longtime teacher and administrator named John Norlin, who I saw speak when I was in high school. He changed the way I thought about leadership and about life. And we came together to create Character Strong, which the whole function of it is to help educators in schools more effectively teach the whole child. So we provide resources like curriculum and professional development and conversations kind of like this one to help us be more effective in the work of social emotional learning, character development, and relationship building, which we know has always been important, but I think is more important than it's ever been before. And in our experience, it's not a question of educators wanting to develop those relationships or teach these skills, but it's always a question of how in our limited time on a day-to-day basis, how do we do this most effectively? So that's how we found each other here, thinking about how do we work together in this sprawling field to help kids flourish, not only academically, but just as human beings.
Yeah, there's certainly a through line there to our work in thinking about how we develop and work with schools and kids, and the importance of whole child, not just getting better at school or getting into college or learning any specific skills. Not that those things aren't important, because they are, but we're creating humans. We're not creating mathematicians or engineers. I mean, we are producing hopefully those things as well, but we don't want mathematicians or engineers or lawyers or doctors or any profession, any career full of folks who are unhappy and unable to, I guess, navigate their internal their internal emotions and to manage their interpersonal relationships. So I guess tell me how you think about social emotional learning, because I think that has become sort of a buzzword, and there, I think, are probably some different ways in which that's defined.
Absolutely. That's our one of our big pitches all the time is if we don't start with common language, then we're missing huge opportunities here, especially when it comes to social emotional learning, character development. We have this fun activity in our curriculum and something we actually do at our trainings where we have people just think about a tree. Close your eyes, think about a tree. And then you have people share what came to mind when they thought about a tree. And almost always the trees that exist in people's minds are rooted in personal experience. People who are the tree that in the backyard where I grew up near my grandma's, or the tree that I drive by on the way to work every day. And I think it's a great example. We call the activity the same kind of tree. It's a great example of the importance of shared mental models, because even the word education, right? Like you say that word education, and the average staff, if there's 35 people in the room, there's probably 35 different definitions of what education is or what it's supposed to be in our world. And that's lovely, but it also is cause for confusion. I always liken it to like, if we're all putting different destinations into Google Maps, which means we're going to arrive, it just doesn't guarantee it's at the same spot. So we talk in our professional development world about, first and foremost, how do we clarify this common language? How do we cast a shared vision so that we're thinking about the same kind of tree, so that we're arriving at the same place? And I think social emotional learning is a great example of that. It's something that gets tossed around a lot. I just learned the origin story. I was spending some time with Tim Shriver, who is one of the founders of CASTLE, the Collaborative for Academics and Social Emotional Learning, currently runs the Special Olympics. And he came together with a guy named Dan Goleman, who wrote the book Emotional Intelligence. And on the phone one day, about 25 years ago, they were arguing what students needed more, social intelligence or emotional intelligence. Tim Shriver was working in a tough area where he was telling Dan, he's like, we can't even talk about emotions here. That's not a thing. We need social intelligence. And Dan Goleman, who of course literally wrote the book called Emotional Intelligence, said, no, we need emotional intelligence. So they agreed to disagree, and they brought them together. So they said, we need social emotional learning. And I love that story just because it's a great reminder that these terms that we now throw around, they started somewhere, and they started with an intention at some point. And Castle's done the work sort of elaborating what that actually looks like. And it's 5 main competencies. Yeah. Self-awareness. What am I doing to understand myself, where I'm coming from, how I arrived here, what I'm feeling on any given moment. Self-management, which of course is that like core skill of emotional regulation. One of the guys who we work with, named Dr. Clayton Cook, out of University of Minnesota, he has this great line in one of his talks. He says, how many of you know an adult who is competent in math or science but not very good at regulating their emotions? To your point earlier, we can create mathematicians, but if they're not human beneath that, we're missing a huge opportunity for a more empathetic, thoughtful world. The third skill that Castle describes is social awareness, which, at the core of that is about empathy and perspective taking and being in community with one another. Relationship skills is the fourth competency, which is just all about my ability to communicate with others, my ability to receive feedback, to give feedback, to listen, to be in relationships, whether that's with family or my friends or romantically. And then the last competency, of course, is responsible decision making, which is just all about, how do I process choices in my life? Do I have tools that even when I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed to make healthy choices for myself or for others? Do I have an ethical framework that I look at the world through? Do I have a matrix that helps me make decisions that are good, or whatever, however we define good? Have I even bothered to define good in my life, what it means to do good or to live a purposeful, meaningful life? So those 5 competencies are the ones that we operate from. We try to draw all of our work and lessons back to those. And it's great. It's a simple and accessible framework. And I think all of those things are the skills of being a thoughtful human. And to your point earlier, it's never to dismiss academics, but we say, character without intelligence is just being nice, which is lovely. Nice people are great to be around, but we need the academic side in order to solve the complex problems of the world today. But the other way is just as bad. Intelligence without character, or intelligence without social emotional learning, or intelligence without empathy is a dangerous combination. And there's a lot of smart people in this world right now who are not very empathetic. And we see that play out in a lot of really dangerous and tragic ways around our world. So social emotional learning, to cast that common language, to think about the same kind of tree, that's what we're talking about. Those foundational pieces of being in relationship with ourselves and in others, and our capacity to be in community, which we say this whole experiment, this whole world is built on our relationship to ourselves and others. So there's a skill set there, and I think we have an obligation to teach it.
So there's several things to tug on there as I'm listening to you, and it's related to, or a lot of them are related to the other pieces which you talk about with the character development. So patience, kindness, honesty, respect, selflessness, forgiveness, commitment, and humility. And this is on your website, characterstrong.com. So folks are listening, want to jump on over there, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But there's a few things that I'm wondering about in so far as I wonder if you ever receive any sort of pushback on whether or not schools should be in the business of character development, and then how the role of one of the things that we really focus everything through is a lens of inquiry. So how the pieces of inquiry fit with the work that you do in working with kids around social, emotional, and character development?
Yeah, it's a great question and accurate in the sense of we get pushback on character occasionally. I only learned actually maybe 2-3 years ago, the first time I attended the character.org conference. I learned that character was a more politically charged word than I first to be. Over the years, it's been weaponized. It's been tried to use as a tool. I think it's been in some situations like very much anglicized. Like what does it mean to be quote unquote good in the world? And that definition oftentimes gets created by those who are in power, which in many cases is just like the white upper class male. So how do we be really thoughtful in how we approach, first of all, what definitions we offer, and then how we unpack that in the context of all the students we serve. So when we talk about character, we talk about it as the 8 essentials, which we borrow with his permission from a guy named James Hunter, who's done thousands of sort of value-based exercises around the world. And the words come from every major world religion and non-religion. And when we talk about them, we always talk about them as like, here's a starting point, and certainly not the whole thing of what it means to be a person of character or quote unquote good in the world. But we also think that they're kind of hard to argue with, right? Very rarely have we worked with a school that says like, we want kids to be more flaky. We want kids to be impatient or unkind. So then how do we teach it in a thoughtful way? And, we offer a common language. We try to go through that lens of inquiry. We're trying to tap into student schema and figure out what does kindness look like in your home? Because like social emotional learning, or like the word education, kindness to one student looks wildly different than kindness to another student. And we always say that for us, it's more important to us that a student can describe what kindness looks like in action than it would be for them to like memorize or regurgitate a definition back to us. And that's in my experience, having worked with about 600 schools around the country and world, one of the things I hear from students often is, we love when people come in and give a motivational talk, but they're like, we need a workout plan. We don't know what this looks like over time. And I have empathy with that, right? I think one of the conversations I love having with educators and with students is this conversation, the distinction between our to-do list and the who we want to be list. And very rarely have I ever talked with someone who doesn't want to be, to some degree, honest or kind or patient or humble. The question, of course, then is like, what do those actually look like in execution? Because I think so much of our current educational paradigm, and it seems not the way that it seems like you all approach it, but I think across the board in many ways, it's a very transactional education, right? It's like you do this, gets returned, and you move on to the next phase. And I think students learn really quickly how to game the system in most circumstances, and then they get to college in some situations, and the average dropout rate in the first year is nearly 50%. I think in some ways it's because the transactional nature of the K through 12 system doesn't prepare them for the adversity or their capacity to fail or experience that adversity as an opportunity to learn. There's a great line out of Dominic Randolph, who runs the Riverdale School District in New York. He says, we're creating fragile thoroughbreds who, when they get to college, they don't know how to experience, failure, rejection, or adversity as an opportunity for learning. So all that to say, the to-do lists in education today are forever long, and they're really concrete. They say, this is your math assignment tonight. Or in the educator's world, how to check off getting your grading done, how to fill out an IEP, how to catch up on emails. And the to-be list we find is more abstract, which I think is what makes it hard to cultivate some of these skills in our life. And so we just offer our signature process at Character Strong is what we call our character dares, which just takes these 8 abstract values and says, hey, here's a way to potentially practice this. Humility, for example, in some situations looks like asking for feedback. It's a humbling process to have external people identify gaps in your life. So here's a challenge. One of our favorite dares is text 5 people in your life the question, what is one way I could be better in our relationship? So immediately, if you choose to take that dare, and all of our dares are optional, then you have an experience in empathy, or in humility rather. But then we also say humility sometimes looks like celebrating other people and seeing good in other people for what they do. So we have another dare that's called their biggest fan. And the dare is over the next week, try to identify one thing in each of your closest friends that you think that they're really skilled at, and give them a compliment on how that thing, that talent or that skill or that aptitude motivates or inspires you to be better in your own life. So our goal with the character piece is not to be prescriptive in saying this is what good is and this is the only way to be good. Our goal is to offer a couple of words that sort of across the world, people collectively, whether it's through conversation or values exercises or religion, have sort of collectively agreed, yeah, like we would be great to live in a more forgiving world. Cool. What does that mean in your life? And then here's some ways to practice it to start to build that muscle. And so we try to bring a lot of people into that equation so that it is never overly didactic in terms of like what you were telling students to be or do, but to invite even families into that process, to invite educators into that process, so that the character development process is more conversational and experiential than it is, hey, this is what good is, catch up. Because we know that students, I think fundamentally we have a belief that students want to be good, want to be kind rather, want to be forgiving, but they don't always know what it looks like. And so to offer that up in a community space and in a learning capacity, I think is a great exercise for schools to engage in. Why? Because we at Character Strong, we define culture as behavior. And if you want students to behave with kindness, well, then we better offer up some practical ways to exercise the skill of kindness. If we want students to be respectful, which exists just about in every student manual or mantra or motto, then we better offer up what practical ways to exercise that muscle looks like. So that's sort of our approach to ensure that we're not like taking ownership over that word or telling people what it is, but to give just mainly a framework to think and an opportunity to be in practice and held accountable in community with your peers and with the staff and with your family to pursue going after just some of these skills that we collectively, I think, know are important, but don't always know how to act on.
Yeah, well, there's some pieces there that caught my attention, especially as we're talking about honesty, and you've got humility, but sort of the crossover in the inquiry piece and how the mindset of inquiry is sort of intellectual humility. And as you mentioned, I do think, and folks who may follow me on Twitter, and I've had some guests on that we have talked about this, but there's a real issue, I think, and I think it's hard to tell how big the problem is, but as you mentioned, there's sort of this weird dynamic happening with all of the best intentions, but really causing some problems. And I don't know how much you all get into this, probably not in a large assembly and maybe in some of your professional development, but that idea of students and the fragility piece where they haven't been and are really threatened by being questioned or by contrary opinions. And that relates in my mind to the honesty piece, that we have some really, really important problems in our sociocultural world that need our attention, and as part of that attention, we have to be honest about how we talk about them, which may be uncomfortable. And I'm a big fan of trying to help my daughters be comfortable with uncomfortable conversations, and we have to be willing to hear things that may not make us feel comfortable, whether it's about our race, about our ethnicity, our religion or lack of religion, or whatever you want to throw into that mix, because there seems to be this real, the pieces of what has been labeled the woke culture, which I think is, again, the sentiment behind it and the problems it's trying to solve are really, really important, but logically it collapses on itself. And I don't know if you'd seen, so we're recording this on the 30th of October, and I think today or in the last 24 hours, there's a video that's caught fire a little bit on Twitter and on the internet about former President Obama talking about woke culture and how that has become some problems. And again, I want to make clear that the sentiments and the goals behind that are something I'm totally on board with, but being able to challenge one another and not calling people out for being honest and having differing opinions is a problem. So again, this may be veering away from the work that you do in a large way, but I'm just wondering how you navigate that, or how you've seen some of those pieces perhaps show up in your work.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a veering at all. I think, I mean, these are the cultural conversations of our day. I mean, more than ever before, we are engaged in these dialogues, and perhaps less than ever before, we're effective at it. So it's almost always in my brain a skill gap, because in whatever size group, whether it's the sample size of our nation or the sample size of an advisory classroom, there's going to be differing experiences and opinions and perspectives. And, the exercise of being in community, and in many ways the exercise of democracy, is our capacity to engage in those dialogues, to challenge each other. And sometimes you arrive at a compromise, sometimes you arrive at a collaboration, and sometimes you arrive at we agree to disagree. But without the tools, the famous Maslow quote, the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm-hmm. I think that's the sort of you look at society at large, that's what we're doing. Is we're just like literally nailing back and forth without a lot of dialogue. So to me, this is not veering at all. I think in many ways, it is these very skill sets that live beneath our ability to engage in civil discourse, right? If I don't have the skill of emotional regulation, then as soon as someone says something that I disagree with, and I'm frustrated or triggered or angered by it, and then it reduces my capacity to engage in dialogue about it, well, now we've stopped making progress. So emotional regulation is a key ingredient to the challenging but necessary conversations of today. Empathy, the number one employable skill that employers are looking for right now is empathy, which is just simply my ability to take someone else's perspective and feel with them. Empathy doesn't guarantee that I agree with you, but empathy is my ability certainly to listen to you and develop some level of understanding, right? Understanding does not equal agreement, which I think is, again, to go back to this like common language piece, I think that's a really important distinction. We talk about forgiveness. One of my favorite conversations we have is about forgiveness. And it's just the way we talk about it is forgiveness is separating the person from the behavior, which is to say, I can still love and care for you, respect you, and say what you just did is not okay to me, right? And some people think that when forgiving someone, what you're saying is what you did is okay. And that's not how forgiveness operates, right? True forgiveness is to say, I still care for you, but I'm going to draw a boundary that you're not allowed to speak to me that way. Or I still care for you, and I'm going to release the resentment that I'm holding about this choice you made in my life. So I think like those skills live underneath our capacity to engage in these moments of disagreement. And there's so many we have a bunch of lessons on civil discourse, especially at the high school level, because we don't want to veer away from this. I think to veer away from it in the context of education is to run scared from the very thing that's going to challenge our democracy the most right now, which is like not serving anyone, even when it is uncomfortable or challenging. I think we do have to tackle these things head on, because we're seeing the byproduct of not.
Right.
And it's what's happening right now.
Yeah.
And so I'm
Go ahead.
yeah, just I'll finish with this thought, which is I'm a big believer that a lot of these like lofty ideals of being kind or engaging in meaningful discourse, I think they don't get enough credit, that they are scaffolded. They are built upon social emotional skills, right? Kindness is a character trait built by social emotional skills. Civil discourse is a whole skill set built upon the foundation of emotional regulation, built upon the foundation of empathy, of communication skills, of self-awareness, of growth mindset. So if we're not teaching social emotional learning, then I don't think we should expect students to be capable, or even adults to be capable of having these conversations.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that is becoming abundantly clear is that words have in so many ways become viewed as violence, and just again any of that mindset where you refuse to be challenged by contrary ideas or beliefs or thinking, as thinking, I am going to try everything in my power to make sure that I am right, or that I win this argument, as opposed to a mindset where it's that intellectual humility of, I want to find out as soon as possible where I might be wrong, and I want people to understand me, not necessarily agree with me. Agreeing with me certainly makes things go much easier and all of that, but agreeing in how we might achieve the same an ideal or a pursuit, a goal that we have in common, assuming we have the same goal in common, right? So I certainly don't want to get people, mislead people in so far as I think, somebody who is a white supremacist who believes white people are the most important race and should be, however you want to phrase that. I would disagree with their goal. So how we do that is not an issue. But then when we talk about some of the ways to solve problems like that, and thinking about whether it's white privilege or any of these intersectionality, the pieces that are prevalent in social justice, for those of us who agree that some of those things are definitely problems worth working on and solving, then we have to be able to let's recognize that we have that same goal and think about how do we solve that, and that process is going to be difficult and often rocky. I'm struck by the sort of the way that lots of the work is moving, which is opposite and contrary to the sort of values and the thinking of Martin Luther King Jr. And again, I think we're veering off track. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but having these larger circles where we're really focusing on the content of somebody's character, which is, of course, this character development. Not that you wouldn't recognize that somebody has differences and that they might be different color skin or different gender or different sexual orientation or whatever, but that we're focusing on the content of the character, and what's happening in so many cases is a focus on the opposite, a focus on what makes us different. And to me, that seems contrary to the way that the direction that we really want to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love thinking about character as one of the few great equalizers, in the sense that I think it's one of the few things that we all have access to. We might, our circumstances and our privilege and how we grew up, where we grew up, our cultural narrative, our paradigms are shaped by so many inputs, and there's so many things beyond our control, whether that is where we come from, whether that is, the socioeconomic background we have, whether that is the color of our skin. Those things predispose people in schools to so many different statistical outcomes, right? And yet I think I don't need a certain body type to practice patience. I don't need a certain color of my skin to practice commitment. I don't need a certain religion to practice respect. I don't need a certain socioeconomic background to practice kindness. And in that sense, it's why I advocate for these things so much, is because I think there are some students in schools that will that will never get perfect attendance. Why? Well, because their circumstances will not allow it. Right? And yet we will recognize kids all the time for perfect attendance. I don't think there's something wrong with that, but we also then recognize kids for athletics. And there are some students that will, whether it's a body type or whether it's their capacity and their schedule, will never be on an athletic team or have an extracurricular after school activity because they have a job after school or they have childcare they are in charge of after school. And so one of the reasons, I think in some ways to your point, why I advocate for these is because they are our common ground. And there are students in schools that will never get celebrated for attendance or academics or activities or athletics, but I think are incredibly resilient, are incredibly respectful, incredibly selfless. And so when we work with schools, I always advocate that, the things that we recognize publicly is one way that we show what we value. And so I think we need to be celebrating these things alongside maybe some of the more traditional things we celebrate in school because, they are the content of our character. And our character is shaped by the thousands of choices we make every single day. And to me, they are some of the few things that actually bring us together as opposed to a lot of the narratives that separate us.
Right. So what about the responsible decision making? I'm a big fan of thinking about how we change our pedagogy and our instruction from a push model to a pull model, where we're helping students really uncover what things they need to know and learn in order to solve a problem or challenge or whatever the case may be. And to me, that is part of how we have maybe created the world we're in, because we have focused, I think, more towards content delivery. And I don't think teachers are necessarily at fault here, because that's what's been in some ways asked of them. But as we think about being what kids need for the future, they need to be able to know what are the really important questions that I should be asking about buying a house or, getting in a relationship or choosing a college or whatever big choices or even small choices they might make. So how do you work with kids and teachers around responsible decision making?
Yeah, well, so much of that is such a great thought. I mean, the whole inquiry approach, of course, is that is role modeling our capacity to self-reflect, right? You're offering up structured ways of thinking, which, so often, if I don't know the right questions to ask myself, if I've never been equipped with those tools, then I'm waiting for someone to tell me what to do in a lot of ways. And I think that the skills of self-reflection are the skills that are, again, to your point, like the exact skills that are required for success, at least in our current world. When I talk about kindness, just in the last year, I've reframed my whole talk to be less about telling people kindness is good, which is what I was trying to convince people of for like 8 years. And now the question is, what gets in the way? So creating a simple means of self-reflection to say, maybe it's not whether or not I believe kindness is good, because I think just about every person universally thinks kindness is a worthwhile pursuit. But like, what is it that gets in my way? What questions do I need to ask myself to close that gap between what I know is good and what I'm actually skilled at? I think the same thing goes for, of course, academically, or whether we're talking about discipline, punitive consequences versus sort of natural consequences. One of our tools that we equip educators with is called the prompt method. It's a research-backed technique. It's a progressive response to low-level problem behavior in the classroom. And to go back to Maslow, it's like if the only tool in my toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there's lots of educators, my empathy statement for teachers is you get taught how to teach your subject area. You don't get taught how to teach behavior. You don't get taught how to respond to behavior in a lot of situations. And so my ability to help students make responsible decisions as opposed to punish them when they don't is a whole skill set unto itself that we believe is necessary to teach today. So the prompt method is basically progressive response, meaning the first letter is proximity control, for example. So teach like the floor is on fire. The closer you get to the student demonstrating that problem behavior, 40 to 50% of that problem behavior is reduced just by being next to the person. R is redirection strategy, which is to give them a simple task with a high likelihood they'll complete it, to get them off, to get yourself and them off of the distraction of that problem behavior. And just by doing those two things well, 70 to 80% problem behavior is reduced. I say all that to set us up for this, which is at the end, if you're still seeing problem behavior, the T in the prompt method is a teaching interaction, where it's a sort of a multi-part series where you're engaging with the student one-on-one. And the whole premise of it is, how do we respond to behavior with empathy and then empower students to make responsible decisions, not because we've told them so, but because we've arrived at them, or we've helped them arrive at them. So one-on-one conversation, you start with an empathy statement, and eventually you arrive at sort of a description of the natural consequence. Hey, Connor, you've been taking time out of class by distracting other students. And so if you continue to talk, the natural consequence is that we'll have to take some time from you after class. And so here, what do you think your potential choices are in this situation? Giving them an opportunity to have ownership and what those choices can look like and how they're going to respond, and then giving them the ultimate choice. Okay, what decision do you want to make? You're either going to go back and continue to be distracting, in which case you'll stay after class, or you'll take a 2-minute break to calm yourself down and then sit back down and get to work. So giving the student that capacity to choose. So from the educator perspective, we try to provide some evidence-based tools that help empower students to make responsible decisions, especially when it comes to behavior, and especially when it comes to like creating a culture in your classroom, some leadership philosophy. And then when we talk to students about decision making, it's about helping develop that framework for how we make those decisions in our life. For many people, for many young people, when you ask them why to go to school, it's to get good grades or get into a good college, because I have to. And we believe, and this belief is rooted in some of Angela Duckworth's work around resilience, that students need a deeper purpose than that. And if we don't know, the way I frame it with students is, if you don't know what you're fighting for in your life, then your life's going to be dictated by your feelings. Right? Whatever we feel like doing in the moment, if I have nothing else to align myself to, then I'm just going to make choices based on what I feel like in that moment. And the way I always describe it to students is, if your whole life is shaped by your feelings, your life is the size of you. You are dictated entirely by your own emotions. But the capacity to self-reflect, the capacity to create an ethical framework for why be in a community, why kindness matters, what is it that's bigger than me that I'm pursuing in this world, gives us a fight that even when we don't feel like doing so, we can still make choices that are responsible for ourselves or for others, because we've clarified why we're doing it in the first place. So from the student and staff lens, we think about that responsible decision making often, especially as it pertains to behavior, which informs culture, which informs everything else we do.
So what are some of the things that get in the way for schools and teachers and maybe even students in developing these traits and characteristics?
Yeah. The simple framework I use when I talk about kindness is there's 3 I's. The first one's incompetence, the second one insecurity, and the third one inconvenience. And the last one I might add would be inconsistency. So incompetence meaning, what are the skills that live underneath the behavior you're asking for, right? So if we're not explicitly teaching something like empathy or growth mindset or resilience or listening, then I think if we're asking students or staff to behave with kindness, right? Kindness is informed by empathy. If I'm not skilled in empathy, then I believe that kindness gets harder, for example. Insecurity, which is just to say, sometimes when we're afraid of something, we avoid it. So if we, as educators, aren't role modeling vulnerability and sharing the things that we are nervous about or insecure about or fear, then I think there's a lot of students who show up every day and are terrified that that their worthiness is attached to their GPA, or that what people think about them determines how lovable they are, or I fear failure. And if If I can't fail, then sometimes I'll avoid doing a thing entirely, simply because I'm scared that I'll fail at it. So to tie that back to behavior, especially something like kindness, if I'm scared of what people think about me, I think kindness gets harder, right? If I'm scared to stand up to other people because I'll be embarrassed or humiliated, then kindness gets harder. If I'm scared of failure or rejection, kindness gets harder. The third one for me is inconvenience, which is just that whole like fight versus feeling thing. Every single day, the average student today has as much anxiety as the average psychiatric patient from the 1950s. Anxieties go up in our world, which has a huge impact on day-to-day behavior. And one of the biggest impacts is empathy. As anxiety increases, empathy decreases. So when I'm feeling anxious, kindness gets harder. I feel like, especially at the high school level, students are busier and more achievement-oriented than ever before, oftentimes at the expense of their mental health. And when I'm busy or exhausted or overwhelmed, kindness gets harder. When I'm hungry, which many of our students are, kindness gets harder. And then the last one, of course, inconsistency. So many schools that I've worked with over the 600 I have, I've spoken at 600 schools for an assembly or a workshop. And a lot of my work has been around like kicking off something like a kindness week or a respect week or a love week or a pride week. And so often, whether they know it or not, like I'm a checkbox, cool, we did a kindness week. Good. Like that's our culture is checked off for the year. Like we're going to have a more kind culture because we did this kindness week, which I would say that, a big message with a little follow through is like going to the gym once, which doesn't do anything. And so the consistency piece then becomes huge. And my co-founder, John, always says we need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. And I think when it comes to behavior, that's huge. We need consistent reminders, which is why that character dare process is so valuable, because it brings people back on a weekly basis, back to these things that we know are important, but when we get busy, they're the first thing that goes. So we have, in addition to the student character dares, we have staff character dares. And we say adult behavior change is the only pathway to student behavior change. And so what are we doing with adults to role model that consistency over time? And so we offer like a weekly challenge to staff that's low burden, but puts us into action. And what we know to be true is if we say this is important, but we don't make time for it, I would argue that it's then not important to us. So consistency. So the short answer, incompetence, insecurity, inconvenience, and inconsistency are the things that I think get in the way of behavior change.
Yeah, well, I would say that those things are consistent with what we see with professional development around pedagogy as well, and an inconsistency is always frustrating. We have done for years, and I've always attempted to work with schools on a longer term basis rather than just a workshop, and actually have just recently made that a little bit more official in our school partnerships option, where 6 months to maybe several years depending on the school and what they want to do. But all of that I say because what we know and we've been frustrated with as any professional development provider and teachers, because teachers know it as well as anyone, is that inconsistency. And they ask when we walk in the room, or any professional development provider or latest initiative walks in the room, and they think, how long is this going to be around? Because I've seen this movie before and I know how it ends. There's a new trailer that runs right after it, kind of thing. And that's really frustrating. And so it is really incumbent upon, as we think about how we root everything in the why and the mission and vision, right? So the purpose, and really clarifying that. And if we're talking about character and we're talking about behaviors, I think it makes sense to call that values, which again gets into the sticky morass of, are you responsible as a teacher? And do parents want teachers being responsible for instilling and clarifying and communicating values? And certainly some parents choose religious schools for that reason. But public schools, if we're thinking about that, there are certainly some people who will push back and say, wait a minute, that's not what you're there for. But I suppose there's got to be some and you alluded to some of them early on, sort of universal set of values of what we can all agree on, or at least reasonable people agree on. And I suppose that comes back to some of those pieces that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can academicize a lot of these, right? And so we actually don't really talk about them as values very often, so much as we describe them as the 8 essentials, which I think when we say that, it's like these things are essential to being in community or really even being successful in the world. So you can talk about patience and then tie a direct line to delayed gratification, which we know has a huge impact size on your future success. You can talk about commitment as like habit building and perseverance or resilience, which we know is critical for both personal and academic success. So I think it's important in some ways, to detach from that idea of like prescribing you values versus, hey, here's more tools in your toolbox that we know are going to make you more successful in your personal and relational life. They're skill sets, not so much values as they are literal muscles and tools that allow us to be really successful in the world. You look at the top 10 things that employers want in their employees right now, and 8 out of the 10 are what we would traditionally call soft skills. It's like communication ability and positive attitude, leadership skills, and you start to tie direct lines between things like forgiveness, things like kindness, things like respect, to some of these traits, and you realize that all these things are just levers and skills that I think we're doing students a disservice if we're not teaching them how to be effective at them. Right? Humility is what a gift to teach humility to young people, so that when they get into the workforce and they have their first performance review, they actually know how to handle it with thoughtfulness and take action on what comes next. It's a gift to future employers.
Yeah. So you do lots of different things. One of the things that you engage in, at least personally, is the assemblies, and I'm wondering how that sort of plays out and plays a part in the impact of that. I think as a obviously a former student and as a teacher, I often wonder about the value of those. I mean, you're talking in front of a gym full of kids, and they're often really fun and interesting. I've seen a little bit of the video of you talking with kids like that, and I guess I'm wondering, because that is certainly not something that I would say I would be able to do well. Certainly a skill set. I'm certainly more curmudgeonly than a school assembly speaker might. You might not find that in the list of things that are characters, traits, or whatever. But I'm not denying the value of them, and so
Sure.
I'm wondering what it is that you are really trying to accomplish with those kinds of assemblies.
Yeah, for many years when my work was exclusively pretty much assemblies, I would still always try to have some tools on the back end to keep the conversation alive. But ultimately, to me, the value of it as someone that studied English and theater is I believe words matter. So being able to provide perspective on certain words helps shape how we act with those words. That's what happened to me when I was in high school. Someone changed my paradigm of kindness and love, and because I thought about it differently, I acted with it differently. And so I'm a big believer that words have power in that way. And I also am a big believer in stories, right? Like stories, the data would tell us stories and experiential learning, play are some of the best, most effective ways that we learn. And what I was always fascinated about in assemblies is in what way do the stories I share from stage intersect with other people's stories, because that's where there's power. If someone in the audience hears me sharing something about my life and says, this happened to me with different names and different faces, and now I feel a little bit less alone, or now I have a new perspective on that thing. All of a sudden, those things can be really transformative for some people. Now, do I hold any illusions that in a room of 2,000 kids on both sides for 1 hour that 2,000 are going to walk away transformed? 0%. In fact, I would say out of the 600 engagements that I have done, there's a few really beautiful moments that stand out to me as moments where I saw a student walk up to me and you just know. I mean, you know it in teaching as you know it in storytelling, that whatever you did that day, it was at the right place in the right time, and they're forever transformed. And that's a gift. I think there's power in that. I don't think it's as scalable or as sustainable as the work that we're trying to do now, which is to say that inspiration without any sort of consistent application, I don't think is going to have long-term change for the masses. And so that's why we pair that now really intentionally with the curricular side of things. So the assemblies are designed to get students speaking a common language, right? To jumpstart the engine and say, hey, if you're inspired by this message in any way, if you resonate with this person's story, awesome. Well, guess what? Now the work comes week to week. Here's what it looks like in action. And we're going to keep giving you tools and strategies and perspectives and challenges to put you into action consistently over time to develop the habits required to live a kind life or live whatever that looks like. Mm-hmm. So that's where the curriculum piece has always been important to me. And I'm really grateful that that's where I'm at now. And we think about it as totally one piece of a much bigger puzzle. If you just do the student work, but you don't do the staff work, I think you're setting yourself up for a challenge. So often I would do assemblies where there was no teachers in the room. And I'm like, this message will never stick if the adults in the building aren't repeating it.
Right.
And so getting that common language with students, but also taking it to staff, which is where we are busier than ever with professional development when it comes to this work, which is exciting because we believe it starts with the adults. So my preferred order of events would be school adopts the curriculum. School sends a small handful of people to a training so they feel excited and motivated, and you have a team of people who lead the charge. We come in and do in-building professional development, so you get the whole staff speaking a common language and starting to develop those habits, like you were mentioning, of like consistency. What are some low burden but ongoing things that we can measure and do that shape adult behaviors in the building? And then bring someone in and do an assembly where they're able to have students now sort of speaking that common language. And now you're firing in all cylinders. And that holistic change is, I think, the only way to have it be sustainable.
Yeah, we know that same dynamic applies again to professional development, and I'm constantly amazed in some ways, but not ever surprised, especially anymore, at the times where I talk with leadership and say, all right, so we're going to come in and we're going to work with your teachers, and principals and administrators often say, yeah, we're going to be involved and we're going to be a part of that. We're going to actually do the same work that they're doing. And they are busy and they have an interview to go to and or whatever, because it doesn't really, they don't engage in the work in ways that we know will help it be more sustainable. And that's frustrating. And I can imagine, I don't know if you have any stories or anything you want to share about how that feels like. So you're sometimes, and it's really gratifying to work with a school or staff where you get that sense and they've talked the talk, but then you're noticing that they're actually walking the walk, and you're like, wow, this is really gonna make a difference, or at least it stands a really good chance of making a difference. And then we've I think probably both been in the opposite, and it feels in some ways self-defeating, and I relate it to how teachers sometimes feel in situations in which they feel like they're salespeople, right? That they're really trying to push something to kids and say, this is really important. You've got to learn this. And kids are like, yeah, whatever, dude. I mean, I don't really care. And in many ways, in many cases, they're right to not really care, because what has been pushed at them is not necessarily all that important, may not be that important, and in the focus of it. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that dread, that feeling where you're like, oh boy, this is really just a waste of energy or time compared to what it could be, or how that feels.
Yeah, I mean, sort of our fundamental, like right off the bat, what we try to speak to is that sometimes this work can feel like another thing on the plate. And our favorite line is that this is the plate, right? This is the plate upon which we build everything else. And so how do we do it in a way that is accessible? How do we do it in a way that is exciting? And how do we prove to you that through some low burden exercises, you're actually going to get your time back? If our most precious resource in education is time, then what are we doing? We got to prove it, right? We got to prove that this is worth our time. And so there's a couple of pieces that we try to go after there, right? Like one of our simple strategies that's research backed is we call it 4 at the door plus 1 more, which is just greeting students at the door when they walk in. And we have a certain way to go about that that's designed to be really relational, but greeting students consistently at the door as they walk in, and then having an entry task for them to do when they sit down. Maybe people have heard that strategy before, but the cool news about it is the research would tell us on average, in the hour-long class, you're going to see 20% more active, engaged academic time. So on average hour-long class, it's 10 to 12 more minutes of time where students are academically engaged versus just quote-unquote time dedicated to instruction. That's a big deal, right? And if you start to add that over time, that really quickly adds up. And so the investment of getting to the door and making that actually like a non-negotiable in your practice, you're actually going to see dividends on that pretty quickly. And so we try to build the case around some of these, like what we would describe as very low burden habits, right? Not costing you a lot of time, but what the data would tell us on the far end is you're going to see whether that's academic engaged time, whether that's strengthening of relationships. And there's so much to speak to there. You know, we start the whole thing by talking about this is all about relationships. And, you know, it's truly only in the past, decade that we're learning about how trauma really affects the brain and learning, and how trauma doesn't always look like what we thought it looked like, and how there are students in every one of our classrooms who have trauma. And in some situations, that trauma is literally preventing them from learning. Like if they're walking in with a high ACEs score or those adverse childhood experiences, the data would tell us that we're like physiologically unable to learn unless, and here's where the research gets good, unless they have a consistent positive adult they can trust, right? So if we want students to learn, if that is our ultimate goal, then we have to do the relational work first. Or else literally, physiologically, there are students who aren't learning. Great. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means engaging in relationship building in really simple, low burden ways. Another one of our favorites is what we call the temperature check. So it's once a week in place of attendance. Have students fill out a digital form, or maybe it's a handwritten thing where they say 1 to 5 how they're doing today, and an optional place to put why. So as the teacher, you start to get relational data on your students that you might not otherwise have access to. And we always say if you don't ask students if they're at a 1, they don't always tell you. And wouldn't you agree that if 5 people in your class check in at a 1 that day, it changes the way you teach, or it should. Because no matter how good the lesson plan you've prepared is, if students are walking in at a 1, they're not going to hear it. And so creating strategies like that for teachers to engage relationally, we think is what we would say it is the plate. Our goal is truly to have more time dedicated to academic instruction and engagement. If our goal is truly to have every student in our classroom learn, well, the data would tell us there's a way to do it, and it's all about relationships.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is important to recognize that it's really hard work, and you know the ideas are important, but it's so difficult in some ways because so many of our kids are coming to us without some of the character traits that we want and need, and so we're, as educators, often forced into being a proxy for good parenting, and that's just not sustainable. But it's no doubt that when kids, as you mentioned, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when kids don't feel that safety and belonging and some of those things at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, asking them to master quadratic equations seems just like a silly ask. So, Houston, I appreciate the conversation and the work you're doing. It's interesting to think about it in the ways that you've posed it. So I want to make sure that folks have a way to get in touch with you and the links and all of those things.
Yeah, please reach out. We love sharing. We have so many free resources designed to support this work, including some of those like the staff character dares I was mentioning. We have an administrator character dare. We have a family character dare that I'd be happy to share with you if you drop me a note. You can find us at characterstrong.com. We're on Instagram with really cool student-facing work at characterstrong. Twitter, where we put out stuff all the time that's fun, at careactor, like the word care, and then ACTER. I'm sure you can put all this stuff up in the show notes. But yeah, please reach out and find us, and we would love to help. We believe that education is the pathway to a better world, and we want to do whatever we can to support it.
Great. Well, again, I appreciate the time and the conversation.
Thank you, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.